Right now, the U.S. Senate is at the center of a defining debate in America: how to assess allegations of sexual assault and who should join a Supreme Court to ultimately make life and death decision about women's rights, national security, and this probe into the Trump White House. Well, we are joined on the beat tonight by a man who defined many of those battles during 28 years in the Senate, John Kerry, until he left that public service to answer a call from President Obama to replace, of course, Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State. Kerry won the Democratic nomination for president and ran against George Bush in 2004, a campaign I worked on. And as people explore the lessons from the Clarence Thomas confirmation hearings, I want to welcome Secretary Kerry and begin by looking at how you approached that issue then, sir, because there was, as you know, skepticism of Anita Hill from senators in both parties. You were especially direct about the gender disparity and sexism in the Senate at the time. Take a look.
It is not the accuracy of those accusations that's at issue here. It is the relationship of 98 men in the United States Senate to the majority of the citizens of this nation, women. And whether or not we are capable of saying that when one woman stands up and suggests this, not because she volunteered it, but because the Senate committee came to her, and then she felt they weren't listening, whether we're now going to listen. That's what it's about.
Senator, you look at that. Is the Senate doing any better in your view? Is Dr. Ford credible? And what does the Senate owe her in this process?
Well, I can't speak to the issues of credibility, Ari. There's no way for me to, I don't have all the facts, and I'm not going to venture forth on that. With respect to the Senate doing better, the Senate's doing better because it has more women in it than it did. I mean, when I came to the United States Senate, I had as many daughters as there were women senators. That's 2. And 1 shortly after was beaten. Paula Hawkins of Florida. So we've traveled a long way since then.
You mentioned gender. It seems sometimes that gender is a bigger dividing line than even the parties or partisanship, which we know is big in Washington. Take a look at Joe Biden in part of the way he approached Ms. Hill in those famous hearings.
Were you uncomfortable? Were you embarrassed? Did it not concern you? How did you feel about it? Can you tell the committee what was the most embarrassing of all the incidences that you have alleged?
Do you think Joe Biden, and you guys served together, got that wrong? And what can the senators do better this time?
Look, I'm not ducking you, but I literally do not have the full context. I don't know what preceded it. I don't know what followed it. I was a former prosecutor. You've got to look at every circumstance here, and I'm confident senators on both sides of the aisle are going to do that.
Your new book probes public service. I want to put up on the screen something I think viewers may enjoy. Every day is extra, and you get into that. Then the photo here we're going to show folks is of you and another famous individual, Bob Mueller, on your high school hockey team. I will say you both have pretty long faces then and now, and good heads of hair for what that's worth. But when you think about the two of you as military veterans, as prosecutors, and people who've lived very different public lives, what is important about public service that you learned? What do you remember of him? And how is that challenged during what is obviously currently a time of strain in the Trump era?
Well, he's a terrific public servant, and I had occasion to work with him a couple of times in the course of my career. I think he wouldn't be doing what he's doing today if his credentials weren't impeccable. And I have great confidence, as I think most Americans do, as people have gotten to watch how he has just quietly, steadily proceeded to perform his responsibilities.
When you look at the Congress today, based on, as you say, the lessons you've drawn from public service, what do you see as the biggest problems?
Unfortunately, the caucuses tend to be more polarized, and the positions are more polarized. I think, I really began to see that happen in the early days of the Gingrich transformation in the 1990s, then to the Tea Party, then to the caucus, to the Freedom Caucus, and ultimately, Donald Trump effected what was essentially a hostile takeover of what was there in the Republican Party. And he's changed it now. And so it's much more polarized, much more divisive. So we have no longer any arbiter about what are the facts. So you hear somebody talk about alternative facts. There's no such thing. But today, the number of daily lies in American politics, the number of accusations. I mean, I'm being accused now of some, but they're all distractions.
Well, you mentioned that.
They're purposefully.
Senator, I'll jump in since you mentioned it. We'll put a direct point on it. You had tweeted back to President Trump saying he should be more worried about Manafort meeting with Mueller than your meeting with Iran's foreign minister. And then you plugged your book, which, that you and Trump could go back and forth in that way. Now, of course, he had said, John Kerry had, quote, illegal meetings with the hostile Iranian regime, which only undercuts our great work to the detriment of the American people. That's not true. There's been no legal finding to that end.
Leave aside, just for a
ahead.
minute, leave aside the question of illegal finding. There is nothing to find. That is, there's a lie. What the president is doing is trying to distract from a reality. I had, I think it was 3 meetings. I can be precise now. It was 3. And one was at a peace conference where many people were invited from all over the world. I had nothing to do with that. And I met there. And another meeting was at the UN General Assembly in New York during the course of the UN General Assembly when people meet with everybody. And the final one was in Munich at the security conference where he was invited by, not by me, but by other people. And ever since Donald Trump has changed the policy, once he pulled out of the deal, I have not met with anybody on that. So this is just, to use the term, this is trumped up. This administration doesn't want to debate the real issues because they can't. They don't have any facts for why they pulled out of the Paris Accords while we have climate change coming at us on a daily basis in its impacts on our country. They don't have a rationale for why it is they can explain that China, Russia, France, Germany, Britain are all trying to keep the Iran deal alive. I don't have anything to do with that. That's their decision. So this is just an effort to avoid their own incompetence, their own inability to do things in Washington in a presidential manner. And I think the American people see through it.
Well, and that's the final big foreign policy question I wanted to ask you. It's often referenced that Donald Trump seems to try to roll back anything he can that Obama did. Part of that is really rolling back a lot of what you and Secretary Clinton did in U.S. diplomacy, and as you mentioned, on Iran, on China, on Cuba, North Korea going in, I suppose, a different direction, TBD, and then, of course, these trade wars, plus Paris and the environment. It's a long list, sir. So I would ask you, what do you think is the most concerning or dangerous approach that he's taking abroad? And is there anything, as we talk about bipartisanship, is there anything you've seen Donald Trump do on the world stage that you can get behind?
I think the general challenge of the administration's approach is they're attacking our friends. They take on Canada and Justin Trudeau. They take on Mexico. They're hammering away at NATO. They're isolating Europe. They're sending general tremors through the world with respect to the reliability of this administration of the United States, except in a couple of quarters where people have been given a carte blanche to do what they want. Now, I supported his effort to reach out to North Korea, and it's obvious from the glitzy Singapore summit that took place that they didn't work out what denuclearization means. They don't yet have specific means of inspecting, specific means of accounting for what the arsenal is, and so forth. And that's the real stuff of an agreement. And,
right.
and there's no evidence right now that that's happened. So Kim Jong-un got exactly what he wanted. Every administration wants this nuclear issue with North Korea to get resolved. And every one of us will hope for the success of the administration because the United States of America and the world will be safer.
Well, and that's a fitting point to pause on. Secretary Kerry, the book is Every Day is Extra. Great to see you again. I appreciate you coming on the beat.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.